On a quiet morning in Brooklyn, the story seems simple. A delivery truck turns onto a narrow street, its red paint standing out against rows of brownstone buildings. A familiar brand, a familiar routine. The driver has made this route countless times before. 6 days a week, the same streets, the same stops, the same basement doors. Nothing about this morning feels important. Nothing feels historic. And yet, this is how the story is often told, that an ordinary delivery driver, going about an ordinary day, unknowingly stepped into the shadows of the Cold War. For decades, people have repeated this version. It appears in documentaries, circulates online, and feels believable, because it starts with someone normal. The driver is not a soldier, not an intelligence officer, not someone trained to look for secrets, just a working-class man following a routine, making a basement delivery. According to the familiar story, everything changes down there. He hears voices, not English, harsh consonants, a foreign rhythm. At first, he tells himself it is nothing. Brooklyn is full of immigrants. Different languages are part of the city. But something about the moment feels wrong. Too early, too quiet, too hidden. Then, through a narrow crack in a door, he sees documents laid out on a table. Photographs, technical images, things that do not belong in a laundromat basement. And just like that, the story takes its first turn.
An ordinary man notices something he was never meant to see. From here, the version most people know unfolds smoothly. The driver becomes curious, then suspicious, then careful. He begins to observe who comes and goes, when they arrive, how they move. Strangers appear only at dawn or late at night, dark sedans, men who scan the street before entering. Nothing dramatic, just patterns that do not feel right. Eventually, the story says, he reaches a decision. He tells his wife. He wrestles with doubt. What if he is wrong? What if he ruins innocent lives? But what if he is right? So he walks into an FBI office. He tells them what he saw, what he heard, what he noticed. And according to the familiar narrative, the FBI listens. They do not dismiss him. They do not send him away. Instead, they ask him to keep watching, to keep delivering, to keep noticing. Quietly, he becomes their eyes on the street.
From that moment on, the story grows darker. The delivery driver lives a double life. One mistake could expose him. One glance held too long could raise suspicion. Meanwhile, the man in the basement continues his work. An unremarkable artist, quiet, polite, invisible. Until one morning, the moment finally arrives. The FBI moves in. Agents surround the building. The man is arrested. His name, the story reveals, is Rudolph Abel, a master spy, one of the most skilled intelligence officers the Soviet Union ever sent to America. Hidden compartments, microfilm, coded messages, an entire spy network uncovered. And at the center of it all, the story says, was a delivery driver who paid attention. It is a powerful narrative. It tells us that ordinary people matter, that vigilance can change history, that even in a global conflict, one small decision can alter the course of events.
This is why the story spread. This is why it survived. But there is something important we need to pause and consider. Because when a story is told the same way for decades, it begins to feel unquestionable. And yet, when historians began to examine the Abel case more closely, certain details did not quite fit. Quiet details, procedural details, the kind that do not stand out in dramatic retellings. Questions like these. Would the FBI in the 1950s truly rely on an untrained civilian for counterintelligence surveillance, especially against a high-level foreign spy? Why was Rudolph Abel already under suspicion before this moment? And how did federal investigators know where to look? Most importantly, why does the documented history of the case focus on someone else entirely? Someone whose role is rarely mentioned in popular versions of the story. A man who did not deliver soda, but secrets. For now, the familiar story remains intact. An ordinary man, an extraordinary discovery.
But as we move forward, we are going to do something different. We are going to step away from the version everyone remembers and look instead at what the records actually show. Because sometimes the most interesting part of history is not the story we believed, but why we believed it in the first place. At first, the story feels complete. An ordinary man notices something strange. He reports it. Authorities act. A spy is caught. It fits the way we like history to work. Simple, human, reassuring. But when investigators and historians later revisited the Abel case, something felt off. Details appeared that no longer aligned with that simplicity. Not dramatic contradictions, nothing explosive, just quiet inconsistencies. The kind that only appear when you stop listening to the story and start examining the process.
Take the FBI's response. In the popular version, agents listen to a delivery driver's suspicions and immediately recognize their importance. They ask him to continue his routine, to watch, to observe, to report. From a storytelling perspective, this makes sense. From a historical one, it raises questions. In the 1950s, American counterintelligence was not casual. The Cold War was at its peak. Mistakes carried enormous consequences. The FBI did not lightly involve civilians in active espionage investigations, especially against suspected foreign intelligence officers. The risk alone would have been unacceptable. If the driver was discovered, if he was followed, if he was compromised, the consequences would not have been symbolic. They would have been fatal. And yet, in the familiar story, this risk is brushed aside. The delivery driver becomes an unofficial asset, trusted, untrained, exposed. That is the first quiet crack.
Then there is the timeline. According to the popular narrative, suspicion begins with a basement encounter, but historical records suggest something else. By the time Abel was arrested, he was not a mystery. He was already being watched. Not closely enough to act, not openly enough to intervene, but watched. If investigators already suspected Abel, what exactly were they waiting for? The answer lies not in a basement, but in intelligence tradecraft. Counterintelligence rarely moves on instinct alone. It moves on confirmation, patterns, and independent verification. And that brings us to a figure almost entirely absent from the popular version of the story. A man whose role does not fit neatly into a feel-good narrative. A man whose involvement explains far more than a chance discovery ever could. The truth did not begin in Brooklyn. It began thousands of miles away, in Europe, inside an American embassy. And it began with a man who was afraid.
His name was Reino Heihanen. He was not famous, he was not respected, and he was not particularly competent. But he was dangerous in a way no delivery driver could ever be, because Heihanen was already inside the system. He was a Soviet intelligence operative assigned to support a far more skilled officer operating in the United States, a man living quietly in Brooklyn under the name Emil Goldfuss, known to his handlers as Rudolf Abel. Abel was not reckless. He was not careless. He had survived years behind enemy lines by doing exactly the opposite. He compartmentalized information, limited exposure, and trusted very few people. Heihanen was one of them, and that was his mistake. Unlike Abel, Heihanen struggled. He drank heavily, ignored tradecraft rules, missed dead drops, attracted attention. Over time, Abel began to see him as a liability, so Moscow made a decision. Heihanen was ordered to return to the Soviet Union. Being recalled was not a neutral event. For Soviet operatives, a return order did not mean rest or reassignment. It meant scrutiny, interrogation, and often punishment. Heihanen understood this. He knew that failure was not corrected, it was erased. And once an operative believed he was about to be erased, loyalty stopped being ideological. It became survival.
For many operatives, such an order would have been routine. For Heihanen, it was a death sentence. He knew what happened to agents who failed. He knew how Moscow dealt with embarrassment, and he knew he would not survive the trip home. So he did something no one expected. Instead of boarding a flight east, Heihanen walked into an American embassy in Paris and asked for asylum. At first, the response was skeptical. Defectors often exaggerate. Some invent stories entirely. Others trade rumors for protection. Heihanen did not look impressive. He was nervous, unreliable, clearly unstable. But he knew things, specific things, tradecraft details, communication methods, locations. Most importantly, he knew Abel.
Not the man on the surface, but the one beneath it. The CIA and FBI began checking his claims, slowly and methodically. What they found was alarming. Hyenen's information matched fragments they already had, pieces that never quite fit together before. Now they did. This is when the investigation truly began, not with suspicion, but with confirmation. Agents traced Abel's movements, his contacts, his patterns. They did not rush. They waited. Waiting was not hesitation. It was calculation.
Arresting Abel too early would have closed doors. Surveillance would end. Methods would disappear. Networks would collapse into silence. So investigators faced a dilemma. Act now and stop one spy, or wait and understand the system that created him. Because arresting a master spy too early can be worse than not arresting him at all. You lose the network. You lose the methods. You lose the chance to understand how the system works. So Abel remained free, watched but untouched. By the time Abel was finally arrested, the investigation was already deep. Surveillance had been established, communications analyzed, connections mapped. The arrest was not triggered by a single observation. It was the final step of a long operation. When the FBI finally moved, they moved with certainty. Agents arrested Abel and searched his workspace. What they found confirmed everything Hyenen had described. Microfilm hidden inside everyday objects, cipher pads, shortwave radios, concealment devices designed to pass unnoticed. This was not amateur espionage. It was professional, carefully planned, carefully executed. Abel did not resist. He did not panic. He did not explain. When confronted, he remained calm, as if he had always known this moment would come. Because in espionage, the only real failure is surprise. And Abel was never surprised.
So where does that leave the delivery driver, the one whose story most people remember? The answer is uncomfortable, but important. It does not mean the familiar story is false. It means it is incomplete. The delivery driver did not imagine what he saw. His observations mattered, not as the cause of the arrest, but as part of the environment in which suspicion became possible. History rarely turns on a single action. It shifts when enough small details begin pointing in the same direction. At some point, an ordinary observation may have intersected with an extraordinary investigation, a detail noticed, a moment remembered, a face recognized. But it was not the foundation. It was not the trigger. It was not the reason the case succeeded. That honor belongs to a frightened man walking into an embassy, carrying secrets he could no longer protect, and a counterintelligence system patient enough to wait. Once the facts are laid out, a new question appears, not about espionage, but about memory. If the case unfolded the way records suggest, why is that not the story most people remember? Why did a different version take hold? The answer lies not in deception, but in human preference. We do not remember history as it happened. We remember it as it makes sense to us. The truth about espionage is deeply unsatisfying. It is slow, bureaucratic, built on compromised operatives, paperwork, and waiting. There is no single moment of revelation.
Just accumulation, defection, verification, surveillance, more waiting. It works, but it is not a good story. The delivery driver version is, it gives us something familiar, an ordinary person, a simple choice between looking away and speaking up. It reassures us that history is accessible, that world-changing events do not require power or training, just attention. This is why the story survived. It flattered us. It suggested that we too would notice, that we too would act. The documented story does the opposite. It reminds us that systems fail, that the greatest threat often comes from within, that truth is uncomfortable. It highlights vulnerability. And vulnerability is rarely what nations wanted to emphasize during the Cold War. So the narrative shifted, not through conspiracy, not through deliberate rewriting, but through repetition. Each retelling smoothed the edges, reduced complexity, and moved focus away from internal failure. What remained was the version that inspired confidence, the version where danger was detected from the outside, not from within.
In the end, the most important question is not which version of the story is correct. It is why one version endured. The Cold War produced thousands of espionage cases. Most were never known to the public. Others were simplified, reshaped, and retold until they became something else. Not lies, but lessons. The delivery driver story is powerful not because it explains how a spy was caught, but because it explains how we want history to work. We want danger to be obvious, choices to be clear, justice to follow naturally. The real world is rarely that kind. Espionage does not usually fail because someone outside sees too much. It fails because someone inside breaks, because loyalty erodes, because fear grows, because mistakes compound. Those are not heroic failures. They are human ones, and they are harder to turn into stories that inspire confidence. So history keeps both versions: the documented truth, preserved in files and testimony, and the symbolic story, carried forward through repetition. One explains what happened, the other explains what we needed to believe. Neither is meaningless.
But they serve different purposes. The delivery driver story reminds us to stay alert, to notice patterns, to take responsibility when something feels wrong. The documented record reminds us of something more unsettling: that no system, no matter how sophisticated, is immune to collapse from within. That secrecy creates pressure, and pressure eventually finds a release. Perhaps the most honest way to understand this case is not to choose between the two stories, but to recognize what each reveals. One about vigilance, the other about fragility. Together, they form a more complete picture of the Cold War than either could alone. A world where enemies were not always visible, where victories were rarely clean, and where history, like intelligence itself, was shaped as much by perception as by fact. That is why this case still matters, not because of who noticed what in a basement, but because it shows how easily truth becomes narrative, and how quietly narrative becomes memory. And once memory sets in, it often outlives the facts that created it. That is not a flaw in history, and in a world still shaped by secrecy, this may be the most relevant lesson of all. It is part of how history survives.